مشاركتك معنا. ما عم يصح لك تشوف الحضور لعدد كبير عم يسمعوا فيك بالقاعة، حدود 300 إنسان. فنتشكرك مرة ثانية إنه رضيت تساهم معنا بمحاضرتين بهالجلسة هي. حنبلش أول محاضرة اللي هي ترانس نازل اندوسكوبيك سيرجري أوف فرونتال ساينس. تفضل.
دكتور نبيل لندشلي، أنا فخور جدا بأن أنا أكون معكم من المؤتمر، وحقيقي أنا كنت أتمنى أكون موجود بنفسي فيزيكال، ولكن طبعا الظروف المحيطة بكورونا كل العالم مخلية الأمور مش في الظروف العادية، وبالتالي إحنا مضطرين إن إحنا ننقل الموضوع أونلاين. أتمنى إن شاء الله السنة الجاية أكون معاكم وتعود أيام الجميلة، أيام الشام، أيام حلب، أيام الملكية والمشاوي والأموي وصلاح الدين. فحقيقي أنا سعيد جدا أكون جزء معاكم في المؤتمر. To begin with, the topic is transnasal. أيوة. هل المقدمة احنا سمعنا الكلام دكتور نبيل؟
أيوة.
هل الكلام كان واضح؟ ممتاز. أنا بس عشان بشكركم جدا، وأتمنى أكون معاكم السنة الجاية إن شاء الله بنفسي فيزيكال، ونهنأ بالمشاوي الجميلة نقول الصداقة الجميلة وأصحابنا الجمال في سوريا الحبيبة إن شاء الله. شكرا لكم. شكرا. Transnasal endoscopic surgery of the frontal sinus. This topic has been chosen by Professor Nabil Dandashli. I understand the importance of the frontal sinus for everybody. This is one of the difficult topics. Whenever you are going to perform frontal sinus surgery, one should be ready. Why? Because usually endoscopic sinus surgery may begin by uncinectomy, middle meatal anthrostomy, and anterior ethmoidectomy. This usually is considered the green zone. But you may proceed to the yellow zone. You open the lamella, you go to the posterior ethmoid and sphenoid. In such a case, you are still relatively not very dangerous, but definitely more difficult than the uncinectomy, middle meatal anthrostomy, and the anterior ethmoidectomy. And then we proceed to the orange zone, skull base clearance along the skull base and frontal recess clearance. bulla is the core, the bulla is the maidan, the bulla is the dawar. The bulla is the most important part of the osteomeatal complex. We have the answer process and inferior. And we have the skull base above the bulla. And we have the basal lamella behind the bulla. One should be aware of this anatomy and the agar anterior and superior, and then the middle turbid covers the osteomeatal complex. If we remove the middle turbid, we will expose the osteomeatal complex. Posterior ethmoid is located behind the basal lamella, covered by the relatively small, tiny superior turbid, but it's very important and marked, and the sphenoid sinus. One should be aware the location of the sphenoid sinus is not located exactly behind the posterior ethmoid, but it's located below and behind. That's why whenever you are going to visit the sphenoid, always inferior and medial. The bulla is the bulla, the bulla is the core, the bulla is the center. The frontal sinus ostium is located at the anterior and superior, here we are, between the bulla and the onset. The maxillary sinus ostium is located between the bulla, onset angle, posterior and inferior. Now, this is the infundibulum. The infundibulum, here we are, this is the infundibulum, this is the room, الحجرة أو المكان. This is the infundibulum, المخروط, and this infundibulum usually is located between the bulla and the onset process. We have here the lateral sinus is located between the bulla, basal lamella, bulla, and skull base. We understand we have here the onset process bulla and the hiatus semilaris inferior الفوهة الهلالية التي تؤدي إلى المخروط أو the infundibulum. And here we have the frontal recess, anterior, and superior towards the frontal sinus ostium. And then we have here the retrobullar recess, and here we are, suprabullar recess. Suprabullar and retrobullar, they constitute the lateral sinus. So it's the anatomy again. Now we are going to concentrate on the frontal recess and the frontal sinus. We understand that anterior to the frontal recess, we have here the beak, frontal beak, and we have here the agar cell. And then we have it posterior, the bulla, the suprabullar recess, and the suprabullar lamella. And then superior, we have the frontal sinus ostium, the skull base, anterior ethmoid artery. And then inferior, we have here the infundibulum and onset process. And then we have the lamina papyracea laterally, orbit, and then we have the medial onset, hiatus semilaris inferior, all of which are covered by the middle termen. So it's anatomy, and anatomy again. Anatomy onset, anatomy bulla, anatomy agar, and then frontal recess in between the bulla and the agar, uncovered by the onset process. The bony structure of the area, the anterior wall of the frontal, posterior wall of the frontal sinus proper, the frontal beak, ulnar, and the agar cell. And then we have here the bulla and the frontal recess in between the frontal sinus ostium and the frontal sinus proper. So it's anatomy and anatomy again. Radiology, we have the agar here, we have the bulla there, we have the onset, the suprabullar recess and the lamella, the anterior ethmoid artery, the skull base, the frontal sinus ostium, and the frontal recess. So it's the anatomy. Being aware of that anatomy, one should be able and competent to visit this area and handle pathology up there safely and effectively. The onset process may be adherent to the lamina papyracea, and in this situation, the drainage of the frontal toward the epidermis, or adherent to the skull base, or the middle termen. And in these two situations, the drainage is toward the infundibulum. Fortunately, most of the cases is basically the first group. The frontal recess usually is located between the frontal recess, between the agar cell and the bulla, and here we have the recess. Sometimes we have a relatively very tiny and small agar, and very tiny and small bulla, and accordingly we have a relatively capacious and big frontal recess. And sometimes we have mega agar and a huge bulla with very limited slim space between both, confronting, rendering the frontal recess very slim and tiny, looks as if it were, which is not the case, as if it were nasofrontal duct. To work at the area of the frontal recess and the frontal sinus ostium and the frontal sinus, one should be aware of the frontal recess cells. Here we have here the agar cell, anterior to the bulla and onset. We have the frontal cell type 1, just one cell above the agar, and then multiple cells above the agar. This is type 2 frontal cell, or we may have type 3, the cell just above the agar and getting inside the frontal sinus proper. And then we have type 4, where we have a mega air cell, more than the 50% of the frontal sinus. At the same time, we have here, this is the bulla, here we are, and above the bulla, we may have an air cell. This is a suprabullar cell. If it is big enough that it grows to go to the frontal sinus, this is the frontal bullar cell. We have also the intersinus, in the frontal sinus, air cell. We never had air cell interfrontal sinus septum. Or we have, here we are, the supraorbital air cell. I just want to show you, this is an old anatomy of the Gray's anatomy. Here we are. As you cannot see, the frontal sinus may be too big, going back along the roof of the orbit. In such a case, as you can notice, there is no complete septum. On the other way around, you may have this situation. Here we have only one opening to drain all this frontal sinus. But if we have a complete septum, we have here a supraorbital ethmoid air cell separate from the frontal sinus. And accordingly, we have here opening for the frontal sinus drainage, and we have here an opening which is specific for the supraorbital air cell. CT triplanar. We have here the right side. We have here, you see, complete septum. So accordingly, this is a supraorbital and this is frontal. On the other way around, here we are. On the left side, we have incomplete septum. So this is a frontal sinus, but this is the supraorbital. Supraorbital ethmoid air cell is the air cell above the orbit and behind the frontal, and it is aerated from the ethmoid. But we have to understand that we have a new classification coming with the worldwide, which is, you see here, we can say that we have the agar cell, which is known, and then we have the supra-agar cell, just above the agar, and we have the supra-agar frontal cell, insinuating itself into the frontal sinus. We have the bulla, here we are, and suprabular air cell, and suprabular frontal extending. This is the bulla frontal cell in the classification. And then we have supraorbital ethmoid air cell, and we have here the intersinus septal air cell. So now and only now, after having all that background of the anatomy, we can proceed to the next step, surgery. Surgery is, I don't want to say easy, but definitely good or easy whenever you are handling the area with utmost care and you understand the anatomy. We have the simple drainage, extended drainage, and median drainage. But we owe much to Professor Wolfgang. Wolfgang was a very good man, pioneer, and he was a very good man thinking of our region, and in fact, definitely we owe much for him. And here we are. This is type 1 draft procedure. What we usually do is do nothing, is to identify the ostium and go in. And here we are. This is one of the situations, the medial termit, and this is the agar cell, the supraorbital, and this is the frontal recess. Frontal recess, here we are, leads you into the frontal sinus ostium. And I just want to show you one of the cadaver dissection where we are using on the left side. This is the frontal recess, the lamina papyracea, and the medial termit. And we are looking for the frontal, using the curved tool. Now we are trying to locate the frontal sinus. We are removing and capping this air cell to expose the frontal sinus ostium. Exposure of the frontal sinus ostium will show you the posterior tape and the anterior tape, and usually we depend on the trans-illumination to proceed to the frontal sinus. One of the cases you see here, papilloma going into the frontal sinus, and here we are. I just want to show you the papilloma. We are delivering the papilloma from within the frontal sinus ostium, delivery, here we are, and we are keeping integrity of the frontal sinus ostium itself without being touched or insulted. This is very important. Draft 2A, whenever we widen the ostium between the lamina papyracea and the mid-termen, and we keep integrity of the mid-termen. In such a case, you see here we are, the frontal sinus ostium, and then we widen the ostium between the lamina papyracea and the lamina papyracea and the mid-termen. And here we are, we can utilize the trans-illumination. This is one of the cases of inverted papilloma as well, but we can skip the video. But here we are, whenever we perform draft type 2, 2B, here we are lamina papyracea and septum. In such a situation, we are obliged to amputate the far anterior superior part of the mid-termen to be able to communicate the area of the lamina papyracea, mid-termen, and septum, and widen it. You see here, this is the draft 2A. We have to remove this draft 2B, and now we could reach lamina and nasal septum. And accordingly, this is one of the situations where we, the allergic fungal sinusitis, 7 times surgery, and what we did here, what we proceeded towards the area up there, supraorbital sphenoid air cell, and we began to deliver the fungal disease supraorbital and the frontal sinus proper, and we began to communicate both, and we use, you see, we are irrigating and we are removing the fungal debris, and here we are, this is the trans-illumination, and then this is the trans-illumination, and then we are using the 45-degree telescope to remove the material. Now we can visualize the posterior tape, anterior tape, and here we are. This is the unhealthy mucosa, but we do not remove this mucosa, and at the end of the story, we can achieve all this widening of the whole stuff and reaching good exposure, supraorbital and the frontal sinus 2B. This is post-operative trans-illumination, as you can see up there. Then lastly, I would like to show you draft 3, draft 3 where we remove draft 2B and draft, here we are, you can skip this, draft 2B and draft 2B, and then the intrasinus septum and the far anterior and superior part of the nasal septum. Whenever we remove that crust, we can achieve very good exposure. I would like to show you one of the cases. Here we are, you see draft 2B, right side, 2B left side, and then we are perforating the nasal septum and communicating both and remove the intrasinus septum using the drill. Now we can use the forehand technique from the right and the left and remove the intrasinus septum and the horseshoe. We can use it in a lot of cases, maybe extensive pyoceal. Here we are one of the cases. This is the inverted papilloma, 13 times removal with the defect in the posterior tape of the frontal sinus. And here we are, we proceeded, this is the MRI. We began to remove the intranasal part and we proceeded posteriorly, maxillary sinus, and then sphenoidotomy. The septal perforation was done from previous surgery, sphenoid, and then we proceeded along the skull base towards the frontal sinus, and then we could reach the right and left frontal sinus at the keel in between, and then we began to remove this keel, and this we have to understand and identify the first olfactory fibers where you have to stop to avoid an insult to the skull base. And then we have here, as you can notice, the papilloma being delivered via this technique. And we began to remove it using the long upturn cabbage forceps, and then the drill to remove the frontal beak from anterior, but be careful, don't touch posteriorly. And then we began to remove the whole stuff with the calcification, and then we had to widen it, the T of the rough, and then we delivered it. And this is the story at the end of the story. The beak, the keel, anterior wall, posterior wall, skull base left, skull base right, lamina left, lamina right, and here are the horseshoe. The defect, navigation system was used, and here are, this is the navigation being used, and I just want to show you part of the procedure. Here are the removal. It was a relatively difficult, and we began to deliver the mass piecemeal. This is the right side, and it was challenging. Mind you, we had a consent from the patient from the start, asking him to be consent to perform an external approach. If we fail to achieve proper exposure and or removal of the papilloma, we would had to change to again at the end of the story. Here we are. This is the removal of the mass, and here we are. It was too big to be removed, and we could remove it using the grasping forceps. Here we are. Here we are, and this is the mass after being removed, and this is the situation of the cavity after, as you can notice here, after removal. We are lucky that we can perform that type. Cystinoblastoma as well could be taken care of endoscopic transnasal. I just want to warn you of the anterior posterior diameter and the possible complication we make inside the skull base. One should be very careful. You make inside the anterior ethmoid, one should be very careful. One make inside the lacrimal sac and nasolacrimal duct, one should be, and then one should avoid any insult to the orbit. In conclusion, anatomy, and this is the approach, which is the anatomy and pathology you are doing with, and the location of disease, and the approach and extent. So it's the anatomy and the anatomy again. And I would like to advise our young doctors at Syria. We use every time we come with our copies of this, hard copies. You can get one free definitely from Stoll's company, and it's very useful, and you can download it from my website. The Pan-Arab Rhinology Society, we are looking forward inshallah in near future نعمل ان شاء الله المؤتمر القادم او بعد القادم في سوريا الحبيبه في دمشق الشام ان شاء الله، واملنا كبير في المشاوي. وطبعا فان ارب جورنال اوف راينولوجي اتمنى زملائنا اللي هم الباحثين السوريين ان هم to submit their articles للبان ارب جورنال اوف راينولوجي اللي هو الباجن. وانا بدعوكم ان شاء الله السنه الجايه يا رب يكون الامور اتفرجت، وزي ما انا نفسي جدا اكون معاكم فيزيكال، اتمنى وجودكم انتم معانا في راينو ايجيبت 28 من 3 الى 5 مارس السنه الجايه ان شاء الله. تحياتي ليكم وشكرا، واتمنى تكون المحاضره مفيده لطيفه ظريفه وعفيفه وشريفه ان شاء الله ان شاء الله. وانا مستعد لاي اسئله، واشكر الدكتور نبيل شكرا شديد خالص. عن الفنجل في ساجيتال بلين وفي كورونال بلين. الساجيتال وي هاف ذا ترانسكريبل فورم، وهنا الكورونال وي هاف اذر. انا ابتدي بالساجيتال هقوله دلوقتي، بس اللي عاوز اقوله ان اختيارك هذا الابروتش يتم بناء على لوكيشن مكان واكستنت قد ايه راح الليجن باثولوجي اللي هو طبيعه الايه المرض. سيرجن بقى الاكسبيرينس اند فاسيلتيز، لابد ان خبره الفريق تحترم. فاسيلتيز هي عباره اريو بلاننج سكال بيس سيرجي في اي مكان، لا لازم يكون في مثلا نافيجيشن، في دريل، في ديبرايدر اند سو اون. في ترانس كريبريفورم ابروتش، في ترانس بلانم ابروتش، في ترانس سيلر ابروتش، في ترانس كلايفل ابروتش. نيجي على ترانسليت نقول كريبريفورم ابروتش. الترانسكريبيفورم ابروتش ده could be taken care of او taking care حاجه زي tissue neuroblastoma دهيت، ان هو ده lesion attached to the skull base or lesion invading the skull base towards the the brain, or lesion like this. In fact, lesion like this, meningioma, usually is taken care nowadays transcranial, easier and definitely more complete. And here we are. If you are going to perform such type of surgery, one should be aware that he or she is going to face the cribriform plate, crista galli, olfactory nerve will be taken care of, the A2 and A1, and meningioma, esthesioneuroblastoma, meningocele, CSF, and or tumors. Esthesioneuroblastoma, as you can notice here, bloody tumor adherent to the skull base, still extradural, extracranial, and what we did here, we used the navigation, began by draft 3, and then we removed the tumor. Here we are. This is the situation before surgery, and the situation after surgery. And here, CS3 of the anterior cribriform plate. In this situation, the best approach is basically, and definitely, is via the transnasal. I hope this video will appear. هل ظهر الفيديو؟ Is it clear? The nasal septum, the middle turbid, meningocele, and then what we did nothing, but we used cauterization, and then we applied the graft. So application of the graft is easy. Now we can proceed. Meningioma. Meningioma is one of the cases where we can take care of the meningioma transplanum. The optic nerve and the chiasm anterior L. ما في نعديه وناخد الباقيين يظهروا ان شاء الله. طمني. Meningioma, pituitary tumor, craniopharyngioma. We have to be aware whenever we are going to perform a transplanum. We have to be aware of the vascular. Here we are. This is the internal carotid artery dividing into anterior cerebral, middle cerebral, A1, A2, and ACOM. And here we are. This is the olfactory and optic. And one should be aware of this. Hopefully this video is working. This is working. ممتاز. This is the chiasm optic nerve. This is the A1, ACOM. Here we are. And A2 up there. And the olfactory nerve. So one, and this is the chiasm. So the anatomy should be respected, and one should be aware of what is being done. Meningioma, a case of tubercle meningioma done by the group, our group. Here we are. This is a tubercle meningioma. What we did in such a case, we proceeded by beginning by harvesting a nasoseptal flap, harvesting here, pedicle along the posterior septal artery, and then we proceeded posterior, and we kept the flap in the nasopharynx, and then we performed a very wide sphenoidotomy into the sphenoid sinus and created a very wide sphenoidotomy, and working inside the sphenoid. Here we are, as we can notice here, exposing the whole sphenoid sinus, and then we are working along the planum sphenoidal. The planum, we are thinning the planum, and then removing. You see, the drill is used to polish the skull base and expose the dura, and this is our work. And then we remove the roof of the planum to expose the dura. Whenever we expose the dura, we stop. The neurosurgeon, جراح الأعصاب، هو الذي يبدأ في العمل بعد ما إن إحنا نقدر إن إحنا نوصل. هو we use a shielded knife or sickle knife to open the dura. Here we are. This is shielded, and then Here we are beginning of opening of the dura. You see the pulsation of the dura and opening. After opening the dura, we cannot see it. This is the meningioma, cauterization of the blood vessels of the meningioma, and then beginning to cauterize and to dissect the meningioma of the surrounding structures, putting in mind avoidance of any insult to the perforating vessels or the optic nerve, optic chiasm, and so on. And it is a very definitely, here we are using the bipolar when needed. And then, see it, this is the delivery of the tumor. And here we are. This is the tumor dissected. Mind you, definitely it is a very, very dangerous, but this is yes, please.
زملاء مضطرين نعيد اتصال بالزوم مرة ثانية اعتبار خلاص وقت الزوم يمكن هو نص ساعة أو شيء 40 دقيقة فبده ينعاد مرة ثانية. اللي حدا له سؤال على المحاضرة الأولانية أو بداية المحاضرة الثانية يتفضل. أنا كان لي تعليق على الانفيرتد بابيلوما اللي عمله بالفرونتال ساينوس. أول شيء حط بدون مرنان بعدين حط المرنان. حقيقة إذا ما كان عندنا انفيجن بجدار خلفي للجيب الجبهي ما بعرف إذا حنشال معه ونعمل له دريلينج محل منشأ أو التصاق الانفيرتد بابيلوما على جدار خلفي للجيب الجبهي أو إذا كان في ريسس وحشي كثير للجيب الجبهي إذا كان حنشال بالتنظير ولا لا. بعتقد هن عندنا بسبب النافيجيشن نحن ما عندنا نافيجيشن للاسف فبعتقد هي باي كورونال ابروش فوت خارجي ممكن يكون مدخل مناسب كثير وغير راض للانف لاستئصال كامل للانفيرتد بابيلوما اذا هي غزت الجيب الجبهي بشكل واسع. ما بعرف اذا حدا له تعليق على الموضوع. حجم الجيب الجبهي وامتداد تهويته وامتداد الآفة. طبعا المرنان يحدد لك امتداد الآفة ضمن الجيب. قد يكون الجيب كله مليان مخاط اكيد ما في مشكله بيكون فقط مدخل الجيب اللي فيه الورم هذا فيك تسحبه للورم. لكن اذا كان ممتد ملتصق بجدران عظميه للجيب الجبهي بعتقد صعب كثير تشيله بالتنظير على الاقل اذا ما كان معك نافيجيشن. بدك نافيجيشن وبدك دريل مايل حتى تعمل دراسه تري بدك دريل مايل السفلة تكون مايله ما تحفر هيك بشكل مستقيم للاسف ما عندنا.